Hello, everyone. We are the Angelman Syndrome Natural History Clinical Research Group based out of Boston Children's Hospital. And today we're meeting with key investigators and key opinionators in the field. My name is Katie Anderson, and I'm a clinical research assistant in the group.
And I'm Leanna Cole, and I'm also a new research assistant in Dr. Wenhan Tan's group.
I can get started if you'd like. My name is Amanda Moore, and for those of you that don't know me, I'm the CEO of the Angelman Syndrome Foundation. We're really excited to be here today to talk a little bit about the natural history study and the importance of collecting data. So we're just going to shoot some questions. And Dr. Tan, I'm going to ask you first, can you just tell us a little bit about what the natural history study is?
Sure, thank you for the question. So I'm Wenhan Tan, and I've been running the Angelman Syndrome Natural History Study for a few years. The Angelman Syndrome Natural History Study is a longitudinal observational study of children and adults with Angelman syndrome. What we do in the study is to assess each participant approximately once a year over as many years as we possibly can. And we collect data on various aspects of Angelman syndrome, including their medical history, their developmental history, as well as all the different medical complications. These data are really important for the development of new therapies and the design of clinical trials. When pharmaceutical companies develop clinical trials, they need to know, first of all, what are the key issues affecting children and adults with Angelman syndrome. And they also need to know what the progress is, what the natural history of Angelman syndrome is. So for example, if we think that a particular therapeutic intervention, a drug, could help with Angelman syndrome and lead to an improvement in a particular outcome measure, we need to know what the natural improvement is in an untreated Angelman syndrome individual before we know whether that change that we see in the clinical trial is actually meaningful. So we are actually analyzing these data right now as we speak to find out what is the magnitude of change in the various outcome measures that we have collected to inform the pharmaceutical companies about the markers of success. Right? So they need to know if they see a change in X amount in a particular outcome measure, they need to know whether the individual would have achieved that change regardless, or whether it is because of the drug. The other reason the natural history study is really important is because we actually still know relatively little about the long-term complications of Angelman syndrome in the older individuals, in the adults. So we learn from all of you who are participating in the natural history study about complications that are not currently in textbooks. Anxiety, for example, gait disturbances as they get older, for example. And these are features of Angelman syndrome that we had not previously been aware of. And it's only by seeing many of these individuals, especially the older individuals with Angelman syndrome, that we start to learn about these issues. And it is important that we are able to learn about these issues, because until we recognize this as an issue, we can't actually start to develop interventions and to help your loved ones who are older and who may start to develop these issues. So knowing when they start to develop these adult onset complications, what the natural cause of these adult onset complications are, is really important in optimizing our management of these individuals. So both from a clinical trials perspective, as well as optimizing the health and outcomes of adults with Angelman syndrome, the natural history study has a really important role to play.
I think that's a great explanation, and it's so important from both of those perspectives for our community. So thank you for helping us to understand that. I think for all the families that are watching right now, just trying to understand what this looks like and if they want to participate. Anjali, can you first introduce yourself, as well as explain to us a little bit what happens when a family comes to a natural history study visit?
Good morning. Thank you for having me here. I am Anjali Sadhwani. I'm the lead study psychologist for the natural history studies And what happens as a at the visit, as a result of COVID, we created a hybrid visit. What happens here is when the family is interested in the study, they reach out to our coordinator who enrolls them in the study. Once they're enrolled, we set up a virtual interview with the family, with both the geneticist as well as the psychologist, where we go over key outcome measures and quick questions that we have. The virtual visit is set up where the family is at home. We only need the parents, and it's set up at a time that's convenient for the parents. During those visits, we'll go over the developmental history of the child, the behavioral history of the child. We'll ask lots of important questions about communication. We have parents fill out questionnaires of key outcome measures such as the ORCA, which is a key important measure for communication. We ask them questions about anxiety. Parents also have access to our online portal where they can answer these questions at their own convenience. Separately from this virtual component of the visit, we do have the families come in for a very short in-person testing. During that, which lasts about an hour and a half to 2 hours, during that in-person testing, we do developmental assessments of the child using the more updated versions of the Bayley Scales of Infant Development, the Bayley-4, which are key outcome measures for the upcoming clinical trials. At the same time, during that visit, Dr. Tan does a brief neurological exam and we take some photos of the child. So the new natural history study is a shortened visit now, where we've made it in a hybrid model where the parents can do a lot at home at their convenience and then come in for a briefer in-person visit.
I think that's so important to allow that access to have families to be comfortable to be at home, because we know traveling with our individuals with Angelman syndrome can sometimes be very challenging. So thank you for that understanding of how a visit works.
Well, I think I could take it from here. And my name is Allison Brent. I am the Chief Science Officer for the Foundation of Angelman Syndrome Therapeutics. I also serve as the Director of the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium. And to really speak about the natural history study, I think I've really learned the incredible value of the data collected in such a study through the Angelman Syndrome Biomarker and Outcome Measure Consortium, as we've moved ever so closer to numerous clinical trials happening for Angelman syndrome and significant disease-modifying clinical trials. And as that landscape has grown, and as most of you know, there are over 23 pharmaceutical companies currently invested in Angelman syndrome. The most important feedback that we get from these companies is how impressed they are with the fact that we have a natural history study that started in 2006. And having all of that data all the way back from 2006 to 2014, and that then progressed beyond that now with a newer natural history study, collecting data not only from the standardized tests that have been done for years that the FDA seems to adore, which are things like the Bayley and the Vineland, which Anjali just talked about. We've actually developed through the ABOM initiative some Angelman specific endpoints. And many of you have participated in assessing and validating these endpoints, one of which Anjali just mentioned, which is the ORCA. And the ORCA is the Observer Reported Communication Ability Measure in Angelman syndrome. And this has really taken off and really taken the likings of agencies like the FDA, as well as is being utilized in numerous clinical trials now for Angelman syndrome. It's one of the first Angelman syndrome specific measures that really captures the communication ability of a specific population like Angelman syndrome, rather than trying to fit the Angelman population into a standardized neuropsychological test for communication. Because of that, we've been able to really see movement in a very sensitive way in individuals with Angelman syndrome and really capture them in a way where we can see some of the nuances of how our kids communicate. And being able to evaluate that in a longitudinal way through the natural history study, we are able to truly see what happens naturally over time as things change. And that information is incredibly important for clinical trial design and for endpoint development to really understand what meaningful change is important to families and what is different from what would be standard longitudinal change over time in these children or these adults. And so really being able to leverage time change of what happens without an intervention, and then what that looks like with an intervention, is the difference between an approved drug and a non-approved drug. And so really leveraging the natural history data, these visits, to be able to capture information not only for communication, but for mobility, for cognition, for fine motor skills, for gross motor skills, for seizures, for history of seizures, for frequency of seizures, how that changes over time. all of that information is so incredibly important for clinical trial design and development that this is the reason that the Angelman space went from 2 pharmaceutical companies in the space only 7 years ago to 23 in the space today. And I really do thank the natural history data for being able to show the whole community and industry that we have so much information that they can leverage in order to help design their clinical trial, because that is a huge piece of the puzzle that makes Angelman syndrome a good candidate for disease intervention. And so really participating in this type of study not only helps understand the disease itself from the day-to-day, but also helps to get pharmaceutical companies the information that they need in order to best design their clinical trials to ensure that drugs move forward because they work and they don't get stalled because we have bad endpoints or bad understanding of the progression and trajectory of the disease. So for me, this is incredibly important for our families to participate in.
Thank you very much for your input. My name is Jonna. I'm one of the research assistants with Dr. Tan's clinical research group. I have a question, maybe Dr. Tan, you could answer. What's next for the data? You know, what's going to happen to the data post natural history study?
So all of the data that we have collected will eventually be deposited into the ladder database, which Amanda can speak to in a bit. We will also over time be analyzing these data and publishing them in manuscripts as well as in the newsletters that you will receive periodically. You will see the results of your participation in real time through the newsletters that we provide. These data will also be used and freely used by all the different pharmaceutical companies to help them develop the best possible medications and treatments for Angelman syndrome.
Just to add on, all the data that is sent out to the LADA database and to pharmaceutical companies is de-identified data. None of your personal data is ever sent out. So that's at a collective level that our study helps out. At an individual level, at the family's request, we do generate a brief report of how your child does on the diverse developmental assessments, such as the ORCA, the Bailey, the Vineland. This can be used either to help them advocate for more services in school, or even just to track your child's development over time. So at the request of the families, we, the psychologists and the team is very open to generating a letter to help you just track changes over time.
I think
that's really great information. And I think it's really important to these assessments and really putting the work in and being able to see how things track for the Angelman community and really where the gaps are and what they need to expect over time as their children and the adults living with Angelman syndrome get older. One question that I have for you, Amanda, and Anjali and Wenhan, please jump in. Can you talk a little bit about the differences between the natural history study and that data collection versus the latter database, as well as the Global Angelman Syndrome Registry? Because I think for a lot of us parents, it is a bit confusing. There's so many different areas where data is being collected. And I think I now understand the collaboration of all of these entities and how important all of it is for the whole community. But I think it would be great if you can explain a little bit about that.
I'll do my best, but I will ask my partners to jump in. I think the one thing that I would say is we're very lucky as a community to have 3 very strong data collection entries or entities working in our community. I think the one thing that is really important that we really wanted to move forward to as a community is how we can get all these data points to talk to each other. Because that's really, we were really good at having data here and there, but how can we bring it together to make it very useful for researchers, for industry, so forth and so on. So as far as the Global Angelman Registry goes, that is a fantastic global registry where parents have access to go in and enter in data long-term. So you can go in, enter your data for the first time, and then anytime you have updates, making sure that you're keeping up with that data. And it's a great platform, very easy to use, and it's a great place for parents to sit in the comfort of their home and really contribute to research and to give your data to a great registry that and then in return talks to these other registries, which we've talked about the natural history study. And the difference, I think, between the Global Angelman Registry and the natural history study, and Wenhan, you can add to this a little bit, but with the natural history study, you're doing a lot of assessments with clinicians as well. So you're in the clinic, they're going through these assessments that you can't quite do at the comfort of your home on your own. You can't do the violin on your own, right? You have to have a professional doing those with you. And so they really are able to take the natural history study, were able to do those assessments and be able to enter that data. And then where Ladder comes in is Ladder kind of takes all of that data and brings it to one place and makes it usable. And makes it be able to talk to each other. And so we are taking the data that we're getting in the Angelman Syndrome Foundation clinics. We're collecting that in Ladder, but we're also created a database that other entities can enter in their data, and it can be usable. It can talk to each other, and we can create different reports and give data out to industry as we move forward. So that's kind of very high level. There's a lot of more nuances to it, but hopefully that helps people understand. But please jump in if anyone else would like to add to that.
Yes. So Amanda is correct that Ladder essentially, I think of Ladder as a data repository. Ladder is sort of the big pot into which we pour all of our data, and from which individual companies, academic investigators, and other people who are interested in data can draw to have a much richer, larger data set than any one particular study can actually provide. So Ladder is really an amalgamation of the Global Angelman Syndrome Registry with natural history study with the Angelman Syndrome Foundation clinics, all of which contribute to the Ladder database. Over time, we are also hoping that pharmaceutical companies that have completed their clinical trials will also deposit their data into Ladder. So you can see Ladder as sort of the master repository of all things Angelman or Angelman syndrome data for future investigators and pharmaceutical companies developing new therapies. The biggest difference between the Global Angelman Syndrome Registry and the natural history study is that in the natural history study, we are doing in-depth, in-person assessments that would not be possible or practicable in a registry. So the Global Angelman Syndrome Registry is a phenomenal resource because it allows, it reaches out to a huge population all over the world, and anyone, anywhere in the world can complete and participate in the registry. However, as Amanda pointed out, there are certain assessments that cannot be easily completed through the registry, such as those assessments that require a psychologist or a physician to administer. There are also important assessments that we perform in the natural history study, not just the Bailey, but also things like head circumference, weight and height, for example. What we need to do as a community is to develop growth charts for Angelman syndrome. This is important both for just general medical care of individuals with Angelman syndrome and also for clinical trials, because we know that head circumference grows, but we also know that their head size is generally small. What we want to know, for example, is if you put a child on an ASO therapy or on some other therapy, does that change the trajectory of head growth? Does that make their head grow a little bit more quickly? But unless we know what the natural rate of growth of the head circumference is in Angelman syndrome, how are we going to know whether a particular intervention, a drug or an ASO therapy actually affects head size? So by coming in to see us every year, for example, we'll do accurate measurements of head circumference, and we'll then create and generate data to create these growth charts that will be so incredibly important for these clinical trials. So I think I see the Global Angelman Syndrome Registry and the Natural History Study as complementing each other. They serve slightly different purposes, and they both have their strengths.
I love that. I think that's great for families to know that they can participate themselves in the registry as they should. And we really need to register people all over the world to understand the demographic and the, the global nature of the disorder. But then they can come to clinics where that data is going to be inserted into the database where they're all going to ultimately speak together. And so no data is really a duplication of efforts, but more so all coming together to be utilized in the best way, where pharmaceutical companies as well as clinicians will have access to that in order to be able to look at it from every angle, from a parent perspective and from parent input, as well as from a clinician perspective and clinician input. So I'm super excited to see that and to see everybody working together. That's really great.
So Jonah, to end, can you tell us how families can reach out to if they're interested in the study?
Yes, so thank you everyone for speaking with us today. I know parents will really appreciate hearing from leaders in the field, so just thank you so much. But for those who are tuning in now and would like to hear more about the study, talk to me one-on-one, or just to enroll, you can email us at asnaturalhistorystudy@childrens.harvard.edu, or if you can give me a call at 617-919-4800.
Thank you. We look forward to hearing from you.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you.